So we're going to take a look at the respiratory system. It's our second organ system. It ties in with the first two that we do pretty tightly. Okay, so this is the respiratory system. The major organ of that is your lungs, obviously. So on your left-hand side there, that's a little cartoon. On the right-hand side is an X-ray of the lungs. You can see that the tissue pretty much lets X-rays right through it, but you can see the cavity. That's called your thoracic cavity or your chest cavity. Down here, you'll see it's really solid here. There's actually a fibrous muscle that goes across here, a really big band of muscles. It's called your diaphragm, and it has a role in breathing that we'll chat about in a second here. Let's see here. But that separates your top from your bottom. So if you remember from biology 11, the top is called your thoracic cavity or your thorax, right, like the bugs. And then your bottom part is called your abdomen or abdominal cavity, just like a bug, thorax and abdomen. So that's where all our guts are. So your digestive tract is way down here, and then you have a muscle band here, and then there's your lungs. Our motto is this one right here. It's right here. In the middle resides your heart, which is a different heart. We got too many hearts here. So here's the heart, doink, right there. And then you have your right lung and your left lung. Okay. And on the bottom here, you got that muscle band right here. Now that muscle band is pretty much one whole complete band of muscle. There is a couple holes in it, one to let in major arteries and veins, and one to allow your esophagus to take food down to your stomach, right? So you can actually have herniated diaphragms where stuff is squeezing past here in your esophagus. It's not a good thing, but it's very rare. Clicker. So we know that one of the big things that we have to take a look at is the cellular respiration part here. So we chatted a little bit about this. We used to get you to memorize all of the steps and stuff like that, right? Where we take products like glycolysis, and then through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain reaction, we'd end up with a whole bunch of ATP for one glucose molecule. Ready? So we're going to chat about this as well. Now, the respiratory system is responsible for bringing oxygen in and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Okay, so oxygen is required for this reaction here, right here, burning of carbohydrates to produce ATP. But one of the byproducts, the waste products, is CO2, and that's the other thing your body will get rid of. Now, in this picture, we actually have three organ systems, right? We have your respiratory system, which brings in oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide, and we have your digestive system, which brings in the glucose or the nutrients. The one thing you don't see here, but it's there, is these black lines actually, and that's your circulatory system. It's the transport system. Okay, so even though you're bringing in oxygen into your lungs, the oxygen travels to your cells via the blood and arrives at the cell for mitochondrial use, and it glucose as well through the blood, and then the waste products travel through your blood back to your lungs to exhale. So there's three. Now all organ systems are related, right? They're all intertwined, they all work together, but this one, these three really illustrate how they work together in concert. So the first part of your respiratory system is your nostril and your mouth. Okay, you've been told to breathe through your nose as much as you can, because inside of there you got little hair, and that hair will trap big particles, like big balls of dust, or sometimes you're outside and all that dandelion fluff is out there. It'll get caught in your nose, right? The other thing too it does is it makes the air moist. So when it arrives at your lungs, it doesn't dry out your lungs. Another thing it will do is it will make it the right temperature. So like if you've ever lived up in the north where it's like -40, -30 degrees, if you're doing exercise outside, which I would do. I grew up in a small town up north. It'd be -30, -40. We're playing hockey outside. You don't want cold air to arrive at your lungs, right? You don't want your lungs to freeze. So breathing through your nose actually gives it a little bit more time to warm up. All right. Now back here is called your pharynx. You may remember that. Right here is your nasopharynx. And this is where we would shove the Q-tip, that really long Q-tip, to check to see if you're COVID positive. Okay? So we know that that virus likes to infect things like your nose, mouth, eyes, right? Those are the entrance ways for it. So what we'll do is scrape your nose here with a Q-tip, collect those cells, and see if those cells have any virus living in them, any viral DNA in it. And I think the protocol is that if you are COVID positive and then you survive COVID, 3 positive tests in a row means that you are essentially cured of it. So I know that's what they were doing for like the NBA and stuff. If you were positive, then you had to have 3 straight negative tests to return to your team, right? So we just swabbed that area. This is your, this whole thing is called your pharynx. Nasopharynx here, tonsils here, and then here would be your oral pharynx. And then you remember this guy, that's your soft palate and your uvula to prevent food from going down, prevent food from going up into your nose. And then this part here, as food goes down, this thing here is called the epiglottis. And that little epiglottis acts like a little trapdoor to hide the opening of your air pipe. And then it would run down your esophagus instead. Okay, remember your esophagus runs parallel, it's right here, to your trachea. So that's your trachea, the pink one. And just below it, sandwiched flat, that's your esophagus right there. And it's usually flattened just to, get out of the way. But it'll stretch. It's got that bit of a star-shaped interior so that it can stretch to take in big food. So that's your larynx. We call that your voice box. The opening, the hole, is called a glottis. And then so that trap door is called the epiglottis. It's above the glottis, epi meaning above. So that will cover the trap door. And then past the voice box or larynx, you go down your trachea, and that will end up at your lungs. Okay. Now your trachea, which is the tube that runs down to your lungs, it's this blue thing right here. It's lined with a whole bunch of little hairs. Okay, they're not actually hair; they're cell projectiles coming from the cells there, and we call them cilia. These guys here, these giant round things, are called goblet cells. You remember what goblet cells make? Yeah, they make gob, which is mucus, right? So this system is to protect your lungs, because every time you inhale air, it's got little fine particulates in it, and the fine particulate gets stuck in the mucus. It's like a fly trap, right? Sticky fly trap. And then we don't want it sitting there, so the cilia, they do this stroking motion, and they push the mucus back to the top of your mouth. And most of us just like, oh, watery mouth, and you just swallow it actually. While others, if you're really sick and you got lots of mucus buildup, you'll spit it out or blow it into a tissue. But that is to make sure that fine particulate matter don't end up in your lungs, way down here. Because if you get fine particulate matter way down in your lungs, you can cause some damage, like smokers do, right? Emphysema. Or if it's stuff like carcinogens, asbestos is a good example. Asbestos can get down there and cause cancer, lung cancer. People working with fiberglass and stuff like that can get glass lung, where glass fiber ends up in their lungs and causes lots of damage. So this is supposed to protect you from it, but it's not foolproof, especially if you're repeatedly exposed to it or you're exposed to it for a long duration of time. Okay? So smoking one cigarette probably won't hurt you, but smoking one cigarette every day of your life could, or being stuck in a smoky building for a whole day could potentially cause some damage. So this is the cilia and the goblet cells that trap garbage and try to move it back up. Does this one work? Let's see if this video clip works.
The process of olfaction, or smelling, begins with hair-like cilia that line the nasal cavity. This lining is called the olfactory epithelium. As air enters the nasal cavity, some chemicals in the air bind to and activate nervous system receptors on the cilia. This stimulus sends a signal to the first-order neurons connected to the epithelial cells. The signal is carried by these neurons from the nasal cavity through openings in the ethmoid bone, and then to the olfactory bulbs of the brain. The signals then move from the olfactory bulbs along the olfactory tracts to the olfactory area of the cerebral cortex.
She likes to say olfactory. It's kind of neat though. See there? There's that nerve there, and then they just have these little tentacles going through the bone to hang inside of your nose there, your nasal cavity. And that's what picks up those the smells. The chemicals in the air will trigger an electrical impulse to your brain. Okay? So as much as we think the respiratory system is responsible for breathing oxygen, carbon dioxide, it has actually a couple roles. One is smell, and another one is, does anyone know what the third one is? So we need oxygen and carbon dioxide. That's the pinnacle of what a respiratory system does. But it does let us smell, which is nice. Anyone know? It's vocalization. Speaking. Right? We're one of the few organisms that vocalizes, and it's one of the indicators of a higher thought, right? To be able to communicate. So we're other organisms doesn't do it, like dolphins and stuff like that, whales apparently, monkeys, but we do it at a much higher level than most other organisms. And without air, we can't make sound. I'll show you a video of that in a sec. So next is the pharynx and the larynx. The pharynx joins the nasal. Oh, we talked about the nasopharynx, oral pharynx. It just joins. It's the passageway for air from here to here. But then now you get to this thing here, and that's called your larynx, also known as your voice box. And this is where sound is created. And if we took a scope and shoved it down your throat, this is kind of what it would look like. Here's a cartoon. So these are actually your vocal cords. These are the membranes that actually vibrate to create sound. Okay? So without air, you cannot make sound. Okay? You have to have air passing through these and vibrating them like guitar strings. Right? Guitar strings, violins, pianos, they're all struck with a hammer, struck with a finger, or pulled with a bow. Well, what activates these strings is air. Okay? And I'll show you a clip here, but we have a video of someone. So you can actually, well, you can't, but you can control those bones to stretch the cords to make different notes and make different sounds. Some people will get polyps on them, so they get these weird growths on them, and then we'll have to go and cut them off. I think, what was I saying? Adele. I think Adele had polyps on there and had to get them surgically removed, and that's why she couldn't sing for like a year or something, because she didn't want to potentially scar her lungs for life and then have her voice change or maybe even lose her voice. I have a video, let me just see, of someone's vocal cords. It's pretty neat. I think it's kind of neat. Respiratory is tricky. Here we go. So it's our larynx. So this person had a laryngoscope. So they're having a scope of her larynx. Let me just move this over. All right, here we go. So right here, this is her epiglottis. So this thing, when she swallows, covers the hole. So it looks kind of like a tongue right now, but when she swallows, it will just go like that, and then it'll go down the esophagus instead of down the throat, right? You don't want her to. So high note, low note. See how the waveform is really, really big, and then when she does a higher note, it's smaller waves. Pretty neat. This is a scope shoved down her throat so that she can see. It's probably through her nose, actually, and then down. So that's a scope probably shoved up her nose, and then down her pharynx, kind of looking down into her glottis. Yeah, and then she's doing it. So 3 main roles with the respiratory system. One is to get oxygen, one is to smell, and the third thing is to vocalize. Okay. Now once you get past the larynx or the voice box, it's the trachea, and the trachea, also known as your windpipe, connects your larynx to your bronchioles. Your bronchioles are the 2 tubes that branch off into each lung. So if we go back to our model again, this number 11 is your trachea. And then you can see it branches off into the left and the right bronchi. Okay. So the trachea has C-shaped cartilage rings and cilia, again, to sweep out any mucus that has collected dust and particles like that. Kind of looks like this right there. Okay, so it's got rings. And the reason why it has rings is, like if this was an animal, you, say, and this is your weird beak, so you're a bird now. But anyways, you stand up, that's fine. You look forward, that's fine. But if you wanted to touch your toes, right, see how it allows you to do that? Now remember, you have to have oxygen all the time. If you're cut off from oxygen, your brain, your body, you actually go into a state of panic because your body knows how important oxygen is. So if you weren't flexible with a hose like this for your trachea, the potential is that it's like a regular hose where it kinks. You know what I'm talking about? When you turn a certain angle, it just kind of turns into a V and no more oxygen or air can travel, and you're in big trouble. So the cartilage ring allows for flexibility without causing any kinks so that you can have a constant flow of oxygen. You can touch your toes and still pretty much breathe, okay, unless you're not very fit and you're like, this is really hard work. Now I did say, I know your brain freaks out because who has here ever had the wind knocked out of them? I have, like playing games or sports, right? And then you get hit in the side or hit in the belly, and all of a sudden you can't breathe, and your brain goes, I think I'm going to die here, right? You actually don't think you can breathe, and maybe you didn't even take a biology lesson ever in your life, because I think I was 7 or 8 when it first happened, and I had no anatomy, physiology lessons, and I knew that it was a bad thing. Right? I knew I couldn't breathe, and I potentially, this is the way I was going to die, which was playing hockey, and I just speared myself when I ran into the boards. But as you can see, I survived, and we'll talk about why that happens in a little bit here. So the bronchus branches to the left and right, similar structure to your trachea in that it's C-shaped cartilage rings, and this is why we want that. Right? You can take that tight turn and not kink, and you can have a constant flow of air in and out. Here are the 2 bronchi. So there's the trachea, and you can see the bronchi here and the bronchi here. So the bronchi splits, and then keeps splitting. It splits and splits and splits. This kind of looks like, if your head's a tree, this looks like the woody part of the tree, right? And then this looks like the roots of the tree. So the roots of the tree end up in your lungs, and well, here we are. This is what it kind of looks like. So it keeps subdividing into smaller and finer tubes. So we call these bronchioles, okay, as they finally get smaller and smaller. And at the very tips of these roots are little sacs of tissue that looks like bundles of grapes, and that's where gas exchange happens. That's where we get the oxygen in and the carbon dioxide out. It doesn't happen anywhere else but at the very tips. Okay? So trachea, bronchi subdivide into secondary, tertiary, quaternary, bronchus, but then finally starts turning into finer tubes that don't have cartilage rings, and we call those bronchioles. And at the very end, we have the little sacs. Okay? This is one of the sacs. It's called an alveoli right here. And you can see how bundly round they are. And that's to increase surface area, because this is where oxygen enters the blood, and this is where carbon dioxide leaves the blood. So increase the surface area, there's more gas exchange happening. You have about 300 million of these bad boys in your lungs, and if we were to peel them, if you ever played with your food and you peeled grapes, if we peeled all of these grapes, you'd have pretty much an 8 by 8 or a 9 by 9 meter square of space of skin of alveoli skin. Okay. Now, I was talking before, if you happen to be a smoker, what can happen is that these guys actually lose their grape shape and they turn into more circular or ball-shaped, and that decreases your surface area. So you don't have as much gas exchange. So every time you breathe in and breathe out, you would not absorb as much oxygen as we non-smokers would. Okay? And that's why you often see those people needing supplementary oxygen, right? They have the little tube and they carry the tank around because the air doesn't have enough oxygen in it to properly oxygenate their blood. So what they have to do is they have to have pure oxygen. They can't have this nitrogen-oxygen mix that we have out here. They want pure oxygen. The other thing we know, too, with COVID is that COVID affects the lungs, and there's been studies done to recognize that there can be alveoli scarring after COVID. And we're not sure how long that lasts for some people, but it can damage these alveoli, and as a result, you don't oxygenate as well as if you were pre-COVID. So, and people talk about that. They're called long haulers, right? People that have COVID infection and they seem to still have difficulties breathing at night, or they can't exert themselves, and they don't know how long it's going to last for. Okay. Another problem with having COVID is if you end up in ICU, we sometimes have to intubate you. We have to give you a respirator, and often that pure oxygen dries out your lungs, and that can cause some scarring of your alveoli as well. And our neighbor that passed away from it, he actually was, I think I may have told you this story. He was in ICU, got better, so they took him off the intubator, the respirator, and then when he came off, he had a relapse, so he needed to be put back on. And so when they shoved the tube down his throat to intubate him, they punctured his lung because of the damage from earlier. So that complicated his recovery by a lot. Actually, he passed away, right? So now these bundles of grapes is moist, and because it's down in your lungs, and there's lots of H2O is produced by respiration, so you're moving water in and out. So you know that sometimes when you have a wet balloon or something, they kind of stick together. We don't want that. We want this balloon to stay open. So it has this special chemical called surfactants that kind of keep them open, right? So when they touch each other, they don't stick to each other and fold up. And that's really important because we want these to stay open all the time, okay? So that we can increase surface area and maximize gas exchange. So as air comes in, that's called breathing. Okay, breathing is simply moving air in and out. There's no gas exchange. So when we find someone that's maybe laying on the floor, if you've taken first aid, you check airway to see if it's open, and then you check for breathing next. Okay, and breathing just means their chest is rising and falling. Air is moving in and out of their lungs. But we don't stop there. We don't go, oh, look at that, airway's open, the person's breathing, we're done. We actually have to check for circulation now, right? Because if blood is not circulating, even if their lungs are going up and down, the blood is not taking any oxygen anywhere, right? And it's also not bringing the carbon dioxide to get rid of. So even if their chest is falling and rising, you have to make sure that their blood is actually moving as well, okay? Because breathing in and out just means you're moving air in and out of the lungs. It does not tell you if you have gas exchange. Now, how do we do that, right? The gas exchange happens, so breathing happens because of this diaphragm and this rib cage with the intercostal muscles. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now, if you take a look, there's 1, 2, 3 lobes on the right-hand side, and there's 2 lobes on the left-hand side, and that's because you have to have a pocket for your heart. So your heart is, everyone goes, oh, is your heart on your left-hand side? It's really actually right down the middle. See that, how it's right down the middle? But it tips to the left, right? So you can see these major arteries are pretty much right down the middle, and then the heart turns to the left. And the noisiest part of your hearts are the valves, and the valves are over here, so on your left-hand side. So when we listen to your heartbeat, we listen mainly to the left-hand side, because that's the lub-dub, the beating of your heart that we can hear is actually the doors opening and closing. Slamming shut, slamming shut, slamming shut. So that's what we're listening to when we listen to your heart, the valves slamming shut. It's not actually the squeezing of your heart. Now, the lungs are covered in this really weird membrane, and that's to reduce friction. Now, you got to remember, you breathe hundreds of thousands of times a day, and the lungs are inside of your thoracic cavity, and every time you breathe, they rub up against the inside of your thoracic cavity. So they rub up inside of here. And we know that, if you took physics with me last year, you know that creates friction. And anytime two objects rub up against each other, you get friction, you get heat, and potentially you can get abrasions and swelling and all that stuff, edema. We want to reduce the friction. We want to decrease the coefficient of friction. So what it does is it puts this chemical in between each of them. Okay? And that chemical makes it so that they flow past each other without much friction at all. So that way we don't have any rawness. You might say, how bad can it be? When people train for marathons and stuff like that, right? Or cyclists ride the Tour de France. For cyclists, what they do is they take all of this Vaseline or lubrication, and they lubricate their thighs and their groin. Because if they're sitting on the bike for 12 hours or whatever a day, they will rub themselves raw. With marathoners, they will put Band-Aids over their nipples because they protrude enough that their shirt will rub over top of them for the 5-6 hours that they're running and cause them to bleed. And we've seen people run across the finish line and their whole shirt is bloody because their nipples have rubbed raw and they're bleeding now, right? So people will you can buy these little Band-Aids to put over your nipples, or you wear special shirts or creams to reduce friction. So now that also allows for suction, because you know that if you take a suction cup and stick it on the wall, sometimes it falls off and you got to lick it. So that membrane fluid actually creates it so that when it gets pulled, it actually is a suction as well. Another thing it does is it spreads the pressure out. So if you've ever had a balloon and someone comes and pokes it, the pressure is not even, and the potential for the balloon to pop goes up. So when the lungs go in and out like this, we want the pressure to be even over the lung to prevent it from being compromised, so that it's evenly spread out and that the lung doesn't pop, right? We can have something called a pneumothorax, where you pop the lung, essentially. We don't want that. The thoracic cavity. So you got this thoracic cavity, and it's lined with this nice smooth material. It's kind of like saran wrap, and the lung itself is wrapped in a smooth material, and it's also like saran wrap. So it's two really smooth materials up against each other, and then in between them you have an interpleural fluid, and that's the thing that's very similar to water. It evens out the pressure, it reduces friction, and it maintains a vacuum, so that when you breathe in and out, it actually creates the vacuum to move air in and out. Here's a cartoon dissection of it. So your lungs have this visceral pleura, so that's the saran wrap on the lungs, and then you get the parietal pleura, which is the saran wrap inside the chest cavity. And then there's a gap here, and in that gap you have that fluid to create the suction, to even out the pressure, to reduce friction. Now, to breathe, to move air in and out, you have to have a pressure difference. And what we got here is a model of the lungs. Now, the glass is the chest cavity. The black rubber band here is the diaphragm. And you can see, if usually your diaphragm is pushed in like this. And you see the lungs go out. But when I pull down, the lungs fill up. See that? And you can hear it too. I can make this bottle breathe. And what I'm doing is when I pull down Do you agree that the space is getting bigger? So if the space is getting bigger, the pressure drops. There's more space for less particles. So the pressure drops inside. And the air particles outside go, wow, it's way more crowded out here than inside, so it runs in. But what gets in the way? The lungs get in the way. So the lungs fill up instead of the jar. And then when I push it in, do you agree that I'm squeezing air out? So it gets more dense in here, right? And then the particles in the balloons go, hey, now it's too crowded. I'm going to leave. And it leaves out. So when I pull it out, the density goes down. The partial pressure goes down, right? Sorry, the pressure goes down. And then the particles run in to try to equalize the pressure. When I squeeze it, the volume goes down, but the pressure goes up. Higher pressure when I squeeze it in. And the air rushes out to equalize it. Okay, so big volume, less pressure, air in. Small volume, more pressure, air out. Okay, so it's actually opposite signs. So how do we do that with this? Well, we use this muscle here. It's called your diaphragm. And it's like a dome. And when it contracts, it flattens. But also these guys here. Those are called your intercostal muscles. Those are the muscles that you eat when you get pork ribs or beef ribs, right? And they're yummy. Lots of barbecue sauce. That stuff will contract and lift the cage up. So your rib cage goes like this and it gets bigger. And then the diaphragm pulls down. And you see how big your volume is now? Your volume gets bigger. Pressure goes down. Air rushes in to equalize it. And then when you breathe out, this goes up. And your rib cage drops because the muscles relax. And you have a smaller space, smaller volume, and as a result, you have more pressure and air rushes out of your lungs. Okay? So that's breathing. That is one of 4 steps. So we have breathing. Here it's called pulmonary ventilation. Then we have something called external respiration. Then we have transport, internal respiration, and finally we have cellular respiration. I think it's right here. So those are the 5 steps to respiration. Breathing, external, transport, internal, and cellular. So as I was saying, breathing is just moving air in and out of your lungs. It is not enough because you need to now take that oxygen, put it into your blood, and take that carbon dioxide out of your blood into the air. But all it requires is muscle contraction of your diaphragm, muscle contractions of your intercostal to increase volume. To exhale, you do the opposite. You relax the muscle and it goes up, and you relax your intercostals and your rib cage drops. Decreased volume, increased pressure, air rushes out. In external respiration is where oxygen finally enters your blood and where carbon dioxide leaves your blood. Okay, this happens at the alveoli, right here. There's so much oxygen right here that it just enters the blood by simple diffusion. There's so much carbon dioxide in your blood that it just leaks into this open space by simple diffusion. They just trade places. It's like carbon dioxide getting off the bus and oxygen getting onto the bus, which happens to be your blood. Then blood takes it, transports it to the cells that it needs to go to, and then it arrives at the cells it needs to, and then we have something called internal respiration, and this is just the exchange of gases. O2 into the tissue now, and CO2 out of the tissue. And this happens inside your organs, inside your capillary beds. And that's why it's called internal respiration. It occurs in tissue at capillary beds. You are made of trillions of cells. And every single cell in your body needs to be 1, 2, or 3 cells away from a blood capillary. If it's 4, 5, 6 away, it might not get enough oxygen. It might not get enough nutrients. It might not get rid of enough toxins to survive. So you might say, but Mr. J, I eat chicken, I eat steak. I don't see blood vessels all through there. And it's because you're cutting through really fine blood capillaries, really fine. In fact, only one blood cell travels through a blood capillary at a time, right? They have to line up in a straight line and go one at a time. So when you cut this, you might not see very much blood at all, okay? I know too, though, if you've ever, eaten chicken or steak, you sometimes get one of those really giant veins in there too, don't you? And that's the blood bringing, that's the vessel bringing blood to or from before it spreads out into these really fine capillary beds. So where are these located? Well, these capillary beds are located everywhere, in your skin, in every single tissue, in every single organ, right? Because every single cell in your body has to be near a capillary to get nutrients, to get water, to get oxygen, to get rid of carbon dioxide, to get rid of waste. It has to be. Cellular respiration happens at the cellular level, and this is where we use oxygen from breathing, glucose from digestion at the mitochondria to turn it to ATP, around 36 to 38 ATP, and the byproducts are CO2 and water. Okay? So, and that stuff is waste. You may remember the steps. It's glycolysis, then it's Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, TCA cycle, and then it ends with the electron transfer chain, right? Right here. So that whole process will take one hydrocarbon molecule of glucose and then convert it into 36 or 38 ATP. Okay, and that's the currency of metabolism for running chemical reactions in the human body. All right. Any questions so far? I know it goes quick, but that essentially is breathing, bringing air in and out of your lungs, getting oxygen into your blood, carbon dioxide out of your blood, transporting it to the cells, getting oxygen into the cells, carbon dioxide out of the cells, and finally taking that oxygen, burning it, glucose with it essentially, to make ATP. Okay, and that's cellular respiration.